Secrets behind silk curtains. Theodora Montgomery stared at her reflection in the gilded mirror of her Manhattan penthouse. Behind her, the skyline glittered like the diamonds adorning her neck at the charity gala she'd just escaped. At 32, she was the sole heir to the Montgomery shipping empire. Worth billions, yet she felt like the poorest woman in New York. "Miss Montgomery?" Her assistant Vivian knocked softly. "The board expects your decision by morning." Thea nodded, fingers tracing the business proposal on her desk. Another acquisition, another expansion, another way to grow wealth she already couldn't spend in 10 lifetimes. "I'll have it ready." After Vivian left, Thea moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows. 3 decades of carefully orchestrated appearances, strategic relationships, and predatory suitors who saw her as the Montgomery fortune, not as Theodora. Her late father's warning echoed. "They'll never see past the money, teddy bear. Never." The decision crystallized suddenly, like the first frost on autumn leaves. She needed to know. Was there more to her than the Montgomery name? By dawn, too, things were complete. Her approval for the acquisition and a plan that would horrify the board of directors. She contacted only one person, her godmother Eleanor, the only one who'd ever treated her normally. "Are you certain, darling?" Eleanor asked over their secure line. "I need this, Ellie, just 1 year. The company runs itself anyway." Within 72 hours, Theodora Montgomery officially departed for an extended wellness retreat in Switzerland. Meanwhile, Thea Williams, with a modest resume showing experience in education administration, arrived in the coastal town of Port Haven, 3,000 miles away. The cottage she rented overlooked the Pacific, modest but charming with weathered, blue shingles and a wraparound porch. Nothing like her Manhattan penthouse or the Montgomery estate in the Hamptons. Perfect. Port Haven Community College welcomed their new administrative assistant with simple curiosity rather than the fawning deference she was accustomed to. Her coworker Bettina showed her around, chattering about the town's quirks. "Most folks here either work at the college, the fishing industry, or the Marine Research Center," Bettina explained. "Not much glamour, but we've got good people." Thea's first week passed in blissful anonymity. No one recognized her face, carefully altered with subtle changes to her appearance. Glasses she didn't need, hair dyed from platinum blonde to rich auburn, casual clothes instead of designer labels. The simplicity was intoxicating. Her tiny office processed grant applications and community education programs. When Bettina invited her to Friday happy hour at Harbor Lights, the local pub, Thea accepted with genuine excitement. Her first non-networking social event in years. Harbor Lights hummed with laughter and conversation. Fishermen, teachers, and researchers mingled easily. Thea sipped her beer, savoring the unfamiliar taste of ordinary life. "You must be new," said a voice beside her. "Port Haven isn't big enough to hide new faces for long." She turned to find a man with sun-weathered skin and observant eyes the color of the sea. His dark hair was unruly, as if perpetually windswept. "Thea Williams," she offered, waiting for the flicker of recognition that never came. "Just started, at the community college." "Julian Reed," he replied, "marine biologist at the research center. Welcome to our little corner of nowhere important." Thea couldn't help her smile. "Maybe that's exactly why I came." Their conversation flowed easily, about the town, the college, his work with marine conservation. Not once did he mention business, empires, or family legacies. He simply saw her, Thea, the administrative assistant with quick wit and curious questions. Later that night, in her cottage with its creaking floors and simple furnishings, Thea stood on the porch watching moonlight ripple across the water. For the first time in memory, she'd spent an evening as herself. No legacy, no expectations, no performance. Just Theodora. What began as an experiment suddenly felt dangerous, like standing on a precipice. Because now, having tasted freedom, she wasn't certain she could ever go back to being merely a Montgomery. Salt of the earth, the Port Haven Marine Research Center stood on the rocky peninsula like a weathered sentinel, its laboratories and offices housed in a repurposed lighthouse keeper's compound. Julian Reed's office, more a cluttered archive of specimens, research papers and equipment than a proper workspace, faced the churning Pacific. Thea found herself there 3 weeks after their meeting, delivering grant application materials that Bettina had insisted needed the personal touch. "Just drop them anywhere," Julian called from behind a massive tank where he was measuring something in the water. "Preferably not on anything wet or alive." Thea smiled, navigating the labyrinth of his workspace. "Your organizational system is unique." Julian emerged, pushing his hair back with a forearm to avoid wetting it. "I know exactly where everything is. Usually." His smile was disarming, genuinely warm without the calculation she was accustomed to in Manhattan. "What brings the college administration to our humble aquatic domain?" "Grant paperwork," she replied, lifting the folder. "Apparently you're notorious for missing deadlines." "Guilty," he admitted, wiping his hands on a towel. "The tides don't wait for paperwork, and neither do endangered species." He gestured to the tank. "Purple sea urchin population study. They're being decimated along this coastline." Thea peered into the tank. "They don't look very impressive for something causing such concern. The most essential things rarely advertise themselves," Julian said, his voice softening. "These little creatures help maintain entire kelp forest ecosystems. Without them, it all collapses." Something in his words resonated with her, the quiet importance of things overlooked. Julian pointed to a coffee pot. "Can I offer you some truly terrible coffee while we go through these forms? I brew it strong enough to dissolve the beakers." 2. Her surprise, Thea found herself accepting. The coffee was indeed atrocious, but the conversation was anything but. Julian spoke passionately about his work, a restoration project for the kelp forests that served as critical marine habitats. His enthusiasm was infectious, his knowledge expansive without being pretentious. "The project needs about $250,000 to expand to the necessary scale," he explained, "but we've only secured a fraction of that. Most investors want quicker returns than saving ecosystems provides." Thea's mind automatically calculated that $250,000 was approximately what she spent on her last vacation. The disconnect between her worlds felt vertiginous. "What about private donors?" she asked carefully. Julian shrugged. "People with that kind of money usually want their names on buildings, not underwater forests no one can see." "Maybe the right donor just hasn't found you yet," Thea suggested. Their conversation stretched into lunch, simple sandwiches from the center's cafeteria, eaten on the rocks overlooking the water. Julian spoke of growing up in a fishing family, of watching marine ecosystems decline, of choosing science as his way to make a difference. "What about you?" he asked. "What brought you to Port Haven?" Thea had rehearsed her cover story meticulously, but sitting beside this earnest man with sea salt in his hair, the practiced lies felt wrong. "A need for change," she said instead. "My life before was constrained by expectations. I wanted to see who I might be without them. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't false either." Julian nodded as if this made perfect sense. "The ocean taught me that sometimes you have to get lost to find your way. Every tide brings something new to shore." Over the following weeks, Thea found herself increasingly drawn to the research center and to Julian. She volunteered to help with community education programs, tagging along on tide pool excursions with local school children, organizing fundraising efforts for the kelp restoration project. Julian lived in a modest cottage not unlike her own, but his was filled with books, scientific equipment, and artifacts collected from beaches around the world. He cooked her dinner one evening, a surprisingly sophisticated seafood stew that spoke to hidden talents. "My mother's recipe," he explained. "She believed science was important, but feeding people you care about is essential." The words, "people you care about," lingered between them, a tentative admission. Unlike the calculated courtships Thea had endured in New York, their relationship developed organically. Julian never pressed for details about her past, never seemed concerned with her financial status. He gave her shells he found on morning walks, articles he thought might interest her, his undivided attention when she spoke. When he kissed her, for the first time, After a community fundraiser that had raised a paltry but celebrated $5,000 for the kelp project, Thea felt something she'd never experienced. A connection unburdened by wealth or status. Just two people, drawn together by genuine affinity. Yet as autumn painted the coastal landscape in deeper hues, her deception weighed increasingly heavy. Each night she returned to her cottage and checked in with Eleanor, managing Montgomery Empire affairs remotely, living her double life with growing discomfort. "The board is getting restless, darling," Eleanor warned during one of their secure calls. "They expect Theodora Montgomery back at the helm by spring." After hanging up, Thea stood on her porch watching Julian's silhouette as he worked late at the research center across the bay, lights glowing in the darkened building. She'd come to Port Haven seeking answers about her identity apart from wealth, but found something far more complicated. A man who valued the essential things that couldn't be bought, and a growing fear that the truth would destroy everything between them. For the first time, the billions in her name felt not like power, but like a wall between her and authentic connection. And as Julian's boat returned to shore, his familiar figure waving when he spotted her on her porch, Thea wondered if she'd finally found what her father thought impossible. Someone who could see past the Montgomery fortune to the woman behind it. If only she had the courage to find out. Meanwhile, the pressure from New York intensified. The board was demanding Theodora Montgomery's physical presence for major contract negotiations. Eleanor could only deflect for so long. "I think I'm falling in love with him," Thea confessed to Eleanor during one of their secure calls. "Oh, darling," Eleanor's voice softened with concern. "And does he know who's doing the falling?" The question lingered uncomfortably between them. On a rare sunny March afternoon, Julian took Thea tide pooling at a remote beach, accessible only during the lowest tides. They carefully navigated the exposed ocean floor, Julian pointing out delicate ecosystems normally hidden beneath the waves. "It's like a secret world," Thea marveled, crouching to observe a brilliant purple starfish. "That's what I love about marine biology," Julian replied, watching her with affection. "The most extraordinary things exist just below the surface if you're willing to look." He helped her across a slippery rock formation, his hand warm and steady. When they reached a protected pool glimmering like a natural jewel box, Julian grew uncharacteristically quiet. "Everything okay?" Thea asked, noting his sudden nervousness. Julian reached into his jacket pocket, producing not a ring as she momentarily feared, but a small glass vial containing what appeared to be a tiny piece of kelp forest preserved in clear resin. "I'm not good at grand gestures," he began, "but I wanted you to have something that matters." He placed it in her palm. "This is from the first restoration site that showed real growth. Proof that sometimes the things we fight for actually survive." The simple gift moved her more than any diamond ever had. "I love you, Thea," he said quietly. The admission carried away on the salt breeze. "I know 6 months isn't very long, but I've never been more certain of anything." Thea's eyes filled with tears, joy mingled with mounting dread. "I love you too," she whispered, the truest words she'd spoken in Port Haven. That evening, rather than proposing as she'd half expected, Julian asked her to move in with him when her cottage lease expired the following month. "My place isn't much, but it's closer to both our jobs and—" He hesitated. "I sleep better when you're there," she agreed, knowing she was only digging herself deeper. A week later, the call she'd been dreading came from Eleanor. "The Jensen contract negotiations have stalled. The board is insisting on your presence, darling. They're talking about appointing an interim CEO if you don't return within the month." The contract represented billions in shipping infrastructure across Asian markets, her father's final major initiative before his death. If it collapsed in her absence, thousands of jobs would be affected. "I'll be there," Thea promised, her stomach clenching. "But I need to handle something here first." That night, she watched Julian sleep beside her, memorizing the contours of his face. She'd come to Port Haven searching for herself and found instead a love she never thought possible. Honest, undemanding, based on who she was rather than what she owned. Now she faced an impossible choice: reveal her deception and likely lose him, or return to New York without explanation and break both their hearts. The following evening, Julian arrived at her cottage with unexpected news of his own. Remember that major grant we applied for? The kelp restoration funding? His eyes shone with excitement. We got it. Full funding for 3 years, plus a significant anonymous donation earmarked specifically for our project. Thea froze. Champagne. Bottle half opened. Anonymous donation? Julian nodded, oblivious to her discomfort. Almost $1 million. The center director thinks it might be from one of those tech billionaires with environmental interests. He grabbed her hands. Do you know what this means? We can expand to all 5 sites, hire the additional researchers we need. His joy was radiant, infectious, and built on a foundation she had secretly engineered. Before leaving for New York, Thea had arranged the donation through 3 separate foundations to ensure anonymity. A parting gift she hoped would sustain his work, and perhaps a way to remain connected to him even if he never knew. As they celebrated his success, Thea made her decision. Tomorrow, she would tell him everything: who she was, why she had come to Port Haven, how completely she had fallen in love with him. She would offer no excuses, only the truth, and accept whatever came. That night, Julian held her close, whispering plans for their future, research expeditions they could take together, ways she could incorporate her interest in historical preservation with his marine conservation work. What if everything changed? She asked softly into the darkness. What if I wasn't who you thought I was? Half asleep, Julian murmured against her hair. The tide goes out, the tide comes in, but the shore remains. He pulled her closer. Whatever changes, Thea, this doesn't. She clung to that promise as dawn approached, hoping against hope that some shores truly could withstand any tide. Storms and revelations. The Montgomery corporate headquarters dominated 50 floors of gleaming Manhattan real estate, its logo, a stylized ship's wheel, visible across the skyline. Theodora Montgomery, restored to her designer wardrobe and executive persona, sat at the head of the mahogany conference table surrounded by board members and legal teams. The Jensen contract modifications are acceptable, she announced, signing the final documents with the fountain pen that had been her father's. Ensure the environmental impact provisions remain non-negotiable. Her month back in New York had been productive, exhausting, and hollowing. By day, she seamlessly reclaimed her role as the Montgomery Empire's calculating head. By night, she ached for Julian and the simple life she'd abandoned in Port Haven. She'd left him a letter explaining everything: her real identity, the Montgomery billions, her reasons for coming to Port Haven. She'd included contact information and a promise that her love, at least, had been completely genuine. 4 weeks of silence confirmed her worst fears. The quarterly projections look exceptional, Ms. Montgomery, her CFO noted as the meeting concluded. Your father would be proud. Thea nodded absently, her mind 3,000 miles away on a rocky coastline. That evening, Eleanor joined her, in the penthouse bearing takeout from Thea's favorite restaurant and maternal concern. Still no word? Thea shook her head, gazing out at the city lights. I've checked with the research center. He received the additional funding, completed the spring kelp planting. Life goes on. Perhaps, Eleanor suggested gently, you should consider that closure might not come in the form you're expecting. You mean I should accept that he wants nothing to do with Theodora Montgomery? Eleanor placed a hand on Thea's shoulder. Or perhaps that Julian Reed needs time to reconcile the woman he fell in love with and the heiress who appeared in the financial papers the following week. A week later, Thea was reviewing acquisition proposals when her assistant interrupted. Ms. Montgomery, there's a Dr. Reed here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he's quite insistent. Thea's heart stumbled. Send him in. Julian entered, looking simultaneously out of place and completely self-possessed in the opulent office. He wore what appeared to be his only suit, slightly rumpled from travel, and carried a weathered leather messenger bag. His gaze took in the sweeping views, the priceless art, before settling on her. Hello, Theodora, he said, using her full name for the first time. Julian. She remained seated, afraid her legs wouldn't support her. I didn't expect to see you here. Apparently, billionaires are difficult to reach through normal channels. His tone was dry but not hostile. Your assistant hung up on me twice before I mentioned having relevant information about the kelp forest restoration project. I'm sorry about that. The corporate platitude felt ridiculous between them. Julian approached her desk, removing a thick folder from his bag. The first quarterly report on your investment. Since you're our primary benefactor, it seemed appropriate to deliver it personally. Thea glanced at the report, then back at him, trying to read his expression. You came 3,000 miles to deliver paperwork? No. His eyes, still that same sea color she remembered, held hers steadily. I came to see if Thea Williams still exists somewhere in this tower. The words unlocked something in her chest. Would you like to find out over dinner? Their meal at a small Italian restaurant, deliberately chosen for its lack of Michelin stars or society photographers, was initially tense, laden with all that remained unsaid. Why didn't you tell me? Julian finally asked, setting down his wine glass. Did you think I'd care about the money? Everyone cares about the money, Julian. My entire life, it's all anyone has ever seen. Then you weren't paying attention in Port Haven, he countered. Because what I saw was a brilliant woman who understood ecosystems, human and natural, better than anyone I'd ever met. Who could organize community support? Who noticed what others missed? Who somehow knew exactly what our research needed? His jaw tightened. Finding out she was secretly a billionaire was surprising, yes? Finding out she didn't trust me enough to tell me was what hurt. Thea's carefully maintained composure cracked. I was going to tell you everything that last night. I had it all planned. Then the grant came through and you were so happy, and I knew once I told you you'd wonder if everything, the funding, our relationship, had been some rich girl's game. Was it? His direct question cut through her defenses. No, she whispered. Port Haven was supposed to be an experiment, 1 year to discover who I might be apart from all this. She gestured to encompass the wealth surrounding them, even in this modest restaurant. I never expected you. Thunder rumbled outside, a spring storm rolling through the city. I've spent 6 weeks trying to hate you, Julian admitted. It would have been easier. Hope flickered tentatively in her chest. And then I realized something. He leaned forward. The woman I fell in love with, her passion for preservation, her quiet strength, her ability to see value in overlooked things, none of that was fake. The only thing that wasn't real was her bank balance. The simplicity of his assessment stunned her. The Montgomery shipping empire is my responsibility, she said carefully. It employs thousands of people. I can't just abandon it. I would never ask you to. Julian's response surprised her. But Port Haven is my responsibility. Those kelp forests, that research, it's what I'm meant to do. The impasse between them hung heavy in the air. So where does that leave us? Thea asked, the question barely audible above the rain now pelting the windows. Julian reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. That depends on whether Theodora Montgomery is willing to build something new, something that honors both our worlds instead of forcing a choice between them. Later that night, they walked through the storm-washed streets, Thea's designer heels abandoned in favor of borrowed rain boots, her corporate armor softened by honest conversation. The research center needs a satellite office focused on international marine conservation, Julian mused as they sheltered in a doorway. Somewhere with connections to global shipping routes, perhaps. Hypothetically, Thea replied, catching his meaning. A certain shipping empire might benefit from enhanced environmental credentials and research partnerships. Their tentative solution emerged. Julian would divide his time between Port Haven and New York, establishing an East Coast research division with Montgomery funding. Thea would restructure her corporate responsibilities to allow regular West Coast residents without abandoning her obligations. As they reached her building, Julian pulled her close under the awning. I'm still angry you didn't trust me, he murmured against her hair. But I understand why. And I'm terrified you'll wake up one day and resent all of this, she admitted, gesturing to the opulence surrounding them. "Then we're even," he said, kissing her with the salt of tears between them. "Because I'm terrified you'll wake up missing your cottage by the sea." The doorman discreetly averted his gaze as the Montgomery heiress and the rain-soaked marine biologist clung to each other, their unlikely reconciliation witnessed only by the indifferent New York storm. Upstairs, with the Manhattan skyline glittering, beyond rain-streaked windows, they began the complex work of reconciling their two worlds. The billionaire and the biologist, both now navigating uncharted waters with only trust as their compass. Rebuilding on Truth Autumn returned to Port Haven, painting the coastline in burnished colors that contrasted with the ever-constant blue of the Pacific. The old lighthouse keeper's compound that housed the research center had undergone a transformation, expanded, laboratories, new equipment, and a recently completed east wing dedicated to international marine conservation efforts. Thea stood on the observation deck, watching researchers launch the monitoring boat toward the restored kelp forest sites. The Montgomery Conservation Initiative logo, a stylized kelp frond intertwined with a ship's wheel, adorned the vessel's side, a visual representation of the bridge she and Julian had spent the past year building between their worlds. "Quarterly. Reports just came in," Julian said, joining her with a tablet in hand. "The Northern Restoration Site is showing a 70% increase in biodiversity." Thea smiled, genuinely pleased by the progress. "And the board meeting?" "Less dramatic than expected. Your restructuring proposal passed with only 2 objections." He handed her the tablet. "Apparently, even old-school shipping magnates can be persuaded by profit margins combined with environmental stewardship." Their compromise had evolved into something neither had initially imagined. Rather than choosing between their worlds, they had methodically woven them together, Thea restructuring Montgomery shipping to accommodate regular West Coast residents and sustainable practices, Julian expanding his research to include global marine ecosystems affected by shipping routes. The transition hadn't been seamless. Julian had struggled with the spotlight that came with being linked to the Montgomery name, uncomfortable with galas and business functions where his research became cocktail conversation. Thea had confronted the challenge of genuine leadership rather than simply inheritance, making decisions that prioritized both environmental responsibility and economic stability. "Dr. Patel needs you to sign off on the Indonesian site proposals," Thea reminded him, scanning the reports. And Eleanor called, "The Frankfurt contracts are ready for final review." Julian nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the research boat was now a distant speck. "Remember when our biggest concern was getting the community college to approve a $5,000 grant application? Simpler times," Thea agreed, a hint of nostalgia in her voice. Their small cottage, Julian's original home expanded with modest improvements rather than ostentatious renovation, had become their primary residence with regular trips to New York as business required. They had chosen Port Haven deliberately, valuing its community and connection to their beginning over Manhattan's privilege. That evening, they hosted a gathering at the cottage. Research staff, local fishermen, college faculty, the unlikely family they'd assembled. Bettina, now head of community outreach for the Conservation Initiative, regaled newcomers with the story of introducing them. "If I hadn't dragged Thea to Harbor Lights that night, none of this would exist," she proclaimed, gesturing expansively toward the research center visible through the windows. "You're claiming credit for a $1 billion conservation program?" Julian teased. "At minimum, I deserve a research vessel named after me," Bettina replied with a wink. As the night progressed and guests departed, Thea and Julian walked along the shoreline, the path they'd traversed countless times throughout their relationship. The familiar rhythm of waves against rocks provided accompaniment to their conversation. "The Singapore expansion is moving forward," Thea said, her business tone softening in the evening air. "The board actually cited our environmental impact assessment as a key factor in approval." Julian squeezed her hand. "Converting shipping titans into conservation advocates. Your father would never have believed it." "He wasn't entirely wrong," Thea admitted. "Most people do see the money first. But he never considered that finding the exceptions might be worth the risk." They reached their favorite outcropping, a natural stone bench overlooking the bay. Julian produced a small velvet box from his pocket, not the traditional diamond she might once have expected, but something far more meaningful. Inside lay a pendant, a piece of sea glass wrapped in silver wire hanging from a simple chain. "It's from our first restoration site," he explained as he fastened it around her neck. "Actual remnant glass that's been transformed by the same waters we're working to protect." Thea touched it gently, understanding the symbolism. Like the sea glass, she had been transformed, not by surrendering her identity but by allowing it to be reshaped through vulnerability and truth. "The Montgomery Conservation Initiative is making headlines again," Julian noted, showing her a notification on his phone. "Ambitious new coral restoration project launches in partnership with global shipping leader," he read aloud. "Good press?" Thea asked, leaning against his shoulder. "The best kind, focusing on the science rather than the sensation of the shipping. Eris and the biologist." He scrolled through the article. "Though there is a rather romantic paragraph about how our partnership is transforming both marine ecosystems and corporate responsibility." Thea laughed softly. "If they only knew." "It started with terrible coffee in your cluttered office." As darkness settled over Port Haven, they remained on their rocky perch, discussing plans both personal and professional. The upcoming research expedition to the Great Barrier Reef, the new sustainable shipping initiative, the environmental education program they'd established at the community college. "Do you ever regret it?" Julian asked suddenly. "Revealing yourself? Complicating everything?" Thea considered the question seriously. "I regret not trusting you sooner," she answered, finally, but not the outcome. Their journey had been neither simple nor smooth. Trust rebuilt slowly, compromises negotiated carefully, two different worlds balanced with deliberate attention. Yet the foundation remained stronger than either had dared hope. Later that night, as moonlight filtered through their bedroom window, Thea reflected on the strange alchemy of their relationship. She had come to Port Haven seeking to escape the weight of wealth, only to discover that true freedom came not from hiding her identity, but from finding someone who saw beyond it. Julian stirred beside her. "What are you thinking about so intensely?" He murmured, only half awake. "About how some experiments yield unexpected results," she replied, curling into his warmth. "The best science often does," he agreed drowsily. "Hypotheses disproven, new discoveries made." In the morning, they would return to their respective responsibilities, conservation reports and corporate strategies, research vessels and board meetings. Their lives would continue to span two worlds, connected by choice rather than convenience. But in this moment, in the quiet darkness of Port Haven, Theodora Montgomery and Julian Reed were simply two people who had navigated the complexities of deception and truth, wealth and work, to build something neither could have created alone. Not just a conservation initiative or a corporate partnership, but a life where authenticity was the true measure of wealth, where being fully known and still chosen was the greatest fortune of all. The pendant rested against Thea's heart, sea glass transformed by time and tide into something new yet somehow stronger, much like the love they had forged between the depths of the ocean and the heights of Manhattan's towers. In the end, it wasn't about reconciling the billionaire and the biologist. It was about honoring the truth that had existed from their first meeting. That value is not determined by balance sheets or social status, but by the capacity to see beyond surfaces to the essential nature beneath, and in that recognition, both had found their most precious discovery.